vaults cracked open and their libraries seized. The charges were fantastical: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, sodomy, devil rituals. Most of it was invented whole cloth by Philip's lawyers. But in an era of fear and religious zealotry, it didn't need to be true. It just needed to be believable. And the Templars? They were silenced with fire and iron. Torture chambers lit up across France. Men were stretched, burned, crushed, flayed, until their confessions dripped from them like blood. They admitted to whatever their inquisitors wanted: that they denied Christ, that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet, that they kissed one another in secret ceremonies. Under unbearable agony, even Grand Master de Molay confessed, then later recanted. It was theatre masquerading as justice. A king destroying his creditors by accusing them of sins so grotesque, no one dared defend them. The Pope, Clement V, was humiliated. He had tried to mediate, but Philip had moved too fast, too ruthlessly. Backed into a corner, Clement ordered his own investigation. Other countries, like England and Spain, hesitated. In many cases, the accusations were dismissed or the Templars released. But in France, the machinery of condemnation rolled on. Philip confiscated their wealth, though much of it mysteriously disappeared. Some whispered the Templars had moved their treasure. Others claimed it had never been found. Still others said the real treasure wasn't gold, but knowledge, secrets, relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. The Templars were no longer a brotherhood. They were fugitives, prisoners, dead men walking. The king had dealt his blow, not with armies but with ink, fire, and lies. And the world would never look at the Red Cross the same way again. By 1312, the end was inevitable. The Knights Templar, once the most powerful military order in Christendom, had been reduced to broken men in dark cells. Their confessions, wrenched out under torture, were used as justification for what came next. And what came next was dissolution. Under intense pressure from King Philip IV, Pope Clement V formally disbanded the Templar Order at the Council of Vienne in March 1312. The papal bull Vox in Excelso stripped them of their titles, their holdings, and their very identity. Officially, the Templars were no more. The Holy See declared it an act of mercy, not a conviction, but a necessary step to prevent further scandal. In reality, it was a political execution dressed in ecclesiastical robes. The order's properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but not everything made it there. Much of the Templars' wealth, treasures, ledgers, and rumoured relics, simply vanished. Some claimed it was hidden. Others believed it was quietly absorbed by Philip's treasury. Whatever the case, the Templars' vast financial empire dissolved like smoke, leaving behind only questions. But the final act had not yet played. In 1314, Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who had spent 7 long years in prison, was led out to a scaffold in Paris. He was to be executed alongside Geoffroy de Charnay, another senior Templar. Both had recanted their confessions, insisting until the end that the order was innocent. And for that defiance, they would burn. They were tied to a wooden stake on a small island in the Seine. As the flames rose, de Molay shouted through the smoke, calling on God to judge those who had condemned him. According to legend, he cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement, declaring they would die within the year. And they did. Clement succumbed to illness within a month. Philip followed later that year, suddenly and without warning. Some whispered it was divine justice, others called it coincidence. But the myth stuck. The Templars had died cursing their killers, and the heavens had listened. With that, the last true voice of the Knights Templar was silenced in fire. Their story ended, not in battle, but in betrayal, torture, and flame. Yet even as they were erased from the map, their legend was just beginning to take root. The fires of the Templar executions died out, but the embers of their legend burned hotter than ever. With the order disbanded, their castles seized and their leaders executed, it seemed their story was over. But something strange happened. Instead of fading from memory, the Knights Templar transformed, from disgraced monks into eternal symbols of mystery and power. The secrecy that had once protected them now fed rumours. What happened to their treasure? Where were their scrolls, their relics, their holy knowledge? Some believed the Templars had spirited away the Holy Grail before their arrest. Others whispered they had hidden the Ark of the Covenant or guarded descendants of Jesus himself. There was no proof, just shadows. But in the medieval world, shadows were enough. Then came the idea that the Templars had survived underground. Though officially disbanded, many former Templars quietly blended into society. Some joined other monastic orders. Some became mercenaries. But others, legend claimed, went secret. They formed hidden brotherhoods, preserving their rituals and relics in silence, biding their time. Centuries later, those stories mutated into myths. The Templars were credited, or blamed, for everything from the construction of Gothic cathedrals to the founding of Freemasonry. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds, that the Templars controlled banks, thrones, revolutions, that they had never truly been defeated, just disguised, that behind every major event in history, some hidden hand in a white mantle guided the outcome. Pop culture didn't help. The Templars showed up in books, games, films, sometimes as heroes, other times as villains. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code turned them into custodians of holy bloodlines. Assassin's Creed made them a global cabal, pulling the strings of civilization. Each retelling distorted the truth, but fed the fascination. In reality, the Templars were flesh and blood. Brave, yes. Flawed, certainly. Religious warriors who tried to mix monastic vows with the violence of war, and paid the price. But myths endure because they offer something history often can't: answers, meaning, mystery. The real Templars died on scaffolds and in dungeons, but the mythological Templars? They still ride in the imagination, eternal, armoured and cloaked in secrecy. And in that sense, Philip the Fair failed. He destroyed their bodies. But their legend? Untouchable. More than 7 centuries have passed since the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned alive on the banks of the Seine. But the Red Cross still lingers, in literature, in architecture, in symbols carved into old stone and whispered through conspiracy theories. The Templars may be gone, but their legacy is anything but dead. They were more than just warriors. They were innovators. In an age when kings still ruled by divine right and banking was seen as a sin, the Templars created a pan-European network of finance, logistics, and diplomacy. Their letters of credit prefigured modern checks. Their commanderies functioned like regional branches of a multinational corporation. They were an early blueprint for globalization, built not with stock markets, but with swords and sacred vows. Militarily, they redefined what it meant to be a knight. Before the Templars, chivalry was a personal code, flexible and often ignored. The Templars turned it into an institution, a discipline enforced with brutal consistency. They weren't lone champions jousting for glory. They were units, trained like modern special forces, willing to die for an abstract ideal. And die they did, often in silence, sometimes in vain, but never without impact. Culturally, they changed how the West viewed religion and warfare. The concept of the warrior monk challenged the notion that holiness and violence were incompatible. They showed that belief could be weaponized, not just in battle, but in politics, finance and propaganda. And when they fell, it was that same belief in their supposed heresy that justified their destruction. Their fall also served as a cautionary tale. The Templars became a symbol of unchecked power, answerable to no one, protected by the Pope, richer than kings. Their downfall exposed the fragility of institutions, even those wrapped in divine authority. It was a medieval version of a corporate takedown, executed not by shareholders, but by royalty in Rome. Today, Their image is more myth than man. But myths shape memory. And the memory of the Templars, courageous, flawed, betrayed, reminds us that history isn't just written in victories. Sometimes it's etched in ash. So the next time you see a red cross on white cloth, remember, it was once worn by men who believed they were doing God's work, until politics, ambition and fear decided otherwise. And in that clash of steel, gold and fire, their legend was born. In 12th century Paris, the world was changing. Trade routes were expanding, universities were rising, and the church was flexing its muscles like never before. It was an age of ambition, political, spiritual, architectural. And in the centre of this rising city stood a dream made of stone. That dream belonged to Maurice de Sully, the Bishop of Paris. Appointed in 1160, he wasn't just a man of God, he was a visionary. The existing cathedral, Saint-Étienne, was crumbling and unimpressive. Paris was growing, and its religious heart needed to match the city's stature. So de Sully dreamed bigger, much bigger. He proposed a cathedral so immense, so awe-inspiring, it would dwarf everything around it. A monument not just to the Virgin Mary, but to the power and glory of the Catholic Church in France. This wouldn't be a Romanesque fortress like the ones before it. It would be something new, something radical, something Gothic. In 1163, that dream began to take form. According to tradition, Pope Alexander III himself laid the first stone during a ceremonial blessing. Construction began on the eastern end, the choir and apse, where priests would one day sing hymns beneath towering arches of glass and stone. But this was no ordinary build. Notre Dame wasn't just a building, it was a generational commitment. And so the people of Paris, stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters and artists, began the work. They hauled limestone from nearby quarries, shaped it with medieval tools, and raised scaffolding that scraped the heavens. Every block was laid by hand, every carving, every window, every rib of the vault, crafted with patience, faith, and sweat. It would take decades to complete even the first sections. Workers laboured knowing they would never live to see the towers finished. Sons inherited chisels from fathers. Generations passed with Notre Dame still rising, slowly, gloriously, above the Parisian skyline. But for Bishop de Sully, the goal was clear: to build a house of God so magnificent that merely entering it would humble the soul. Notre Dame was never meant to be just a church. It was an act of worship carved in stone, a testament to what humanity could build when it aimed for heaven. The first stone was only the beginning. What came next would reshape the skyline and the soul of medieval Europe. As the 1170s unfolded, Notre Dame began to rise, not as a structure, but as a symbol. In a city of narrow timber houses and muddy streets, the cathedral slowly took form, towering over the skyline like a stone sermon. The Gothic style, still in its infancy, was about to redefine what churches could be, not just shelters of prayer, but instruments of awe. The work moved from east to west, beginning with the choir, where priests would one day perform sacred rites, and then to the nave, the vast open space for the common faithful. The architecture was revolutionary. The walls were thinner, the ceilings higher. The pointed arches allowed more weight to be shifted downward. And those ribbed vaults? They didn't just support the ceiling. They sang upward, drawing the eye and the soul toward heaven. But perhaps the most radical idea was light. Unlike the dim Romanesque churches of old, Notre Dame was built to glow. Massive stained glass windows began to appear, filtering coloured light into sacred geometry. Scenes from scripture burst into life with the rising sun. The church wasn't just telling stories anymore, it was illuminating them. Every piece of Notre Dame had meaning. The columns weren't just supports, they represented saints. The archways weren't just decoration, they were passageways to salvation. The stone was theology, and the masons were its scribes. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Paris was transforming. The cathedral became a heartbeat. Markets clustered around it. Sermons echoed across the Seine. Students from the burgeoning University of Paris gathered in its shadow. Notre Dame wasn't just a building, it was becoming the soul of the city. Yet progress was slow. There were no cranes, no power tools, just muscle, wood scaffolding, and endless resolve. Hundreds of workers toiled year after year. When one died, another took his place. Names were rarely recorded. Their reward wasn't fame, but faith. They built not for themselves, but for God and generations unborn. By 1200, the choir and much of the nave stood tall. The outlines of a miracle were taking shape. Notre Dame was no longer a dream. It was stone and glass, sweat and prayer. And just as the structure reached skyward, so too did the ambitions of its builders. Because what they planned next would defy gravity and reason. Notre Dame was unlike anything the city had ever seen, but it was also dangerously ambitious. As the walls rose and the vaulted ceilings expanded, a problem emerged. The weight. The stone ceilings pressed outward, not just downward. The higher the vaults climbed, the more they threatened to push the walls apart. Traditional Romanesque churches solved this with thick walls and tiny windows, but Notre Dame was built to breathe, to glow, to reach the heavens in both spirit and space. That's when the Masons did something revolutionary. They took a bold architectural idea, one barely tested at the time, and ran with it, the flying buttress. These weren't mere supports. They were external arms of stone, arching from the upper walls down to solid piers standing apart from the main building. Like skeletal wings, they braced the cathedral from the outside, transferring the outward force of the ceiling into the ground, where it could do no harm. From the ground, they looked impossibly delicate, like lace made of limestone. But they were engineering genius, and they allowed Notre Dame to become what it was always meant to be, a structure of air, light, and impossible height. The use of flying buttresses changed everything. With the pressure off the interior walls, the builders could add even more windows. The great rose windows, vast wheels of stained glass depicting saints, angels, and apocalypse, were no longer a dream. They became reality. Colour exploded into the sacred space, and God's stories now came not just from the pulpit, but from sunlight itself. Ironically, the original plans for Notre Dame didn't include flying buttresses. Early Gothic builders hadn't yet grasped their full potential. But as the structure grew, so did the strain. The masons adapted on the fly, literally. They began adding these stone wings in the early 1200s, turning necessity into poetry. Critics at the time were divided. Some thought the exposed supports were unsightly, interrupting the clean silhouette of the building. But most stood in awe. Notre Dame looked like it was being held in place by stone angels mid-flight. The cathedral was no longer just a house of God. It was a living demonstration of what faith and math could build together. A hymn carved in gravity-defying limestone, and its wings had only just begun to spread. By the early 1200s, Notre Dame had already transformed the Parisian skyline, but its most iconic features were still taking shape. As the eastern end neared completion, attention shifted westward. What rose there would become the face of the cathedral, the part most people would recognise first: the twin towers and the monumental west facade. This facade wasn't just an entrance, it was a statement, spiritual, architectural, and political. The church wanted you to feel small as you approached it, and it succeeded. The doors soared to impossible heights. Above them, rows of sculpted kings, prophets, saints, and demons watched every visitor. You weren't just entering a building, you were walking into sacred judgment. Construction began on the west towers around the 12th and 20s. Like everything else at Notre Dame, they took decades to finish. Each tower rose in stages, block by block, higher and higher, until they reached nearly 70 metres tall. And yet, they were never completed as originally planned. No spires, no needle points, just massive, flat-topped silhouettes, majestic in their simplicity. Between the towers sat the Gallery of Kings, 28 statues representing the monarchs of Judah, misunderstood during the French Revolution as French kings and tragically decapitated by angry mobs. But during the 13th century, they sent a clear message: divine right, heavenly order, sacred rule. The church and the crown walked hand in hand, and this was their front porch. Below them, the three great portals served as theological storytelling in stone. The central one, the portal of the Last Judgment, was carved with Christ seated in glory, flanked by angels, demons, and resurrected souls rising from their graves. To the illiterate masses, these scenes weren't decoration. They were doctrine. The message was clear: enter with reverence. Eternity starts here. Above the doors, a rose window bloomed into being, nearly 10 meters across, framed by intricate tracery and flanked by statues of the Virgin Mary and Child. Light passed through coloured glass like a divine spotlight, projecting saints across the nave. By the mid-1200s, the towers were nearly done. The facade stood complete, solemn, symmetrical, overwhelming. It was a fortress of faith, a billboard for God's authority, and a warning to the sinner. And yet, the builders weren't done. The heart of Notre Dame still needed finishing. The transept, the roof, the spire that would one day pierce the clouds. They had built its face. Now they would give it a crown. With the towers and west facade standing in proud defiance of gravity, Notre Dame was becoming more than a shell. It needed a soul, and that soul lived inside, within the vast expanse of its nave, its transepts, and its sacred choir. These were the spaces that would carry the voices of monks, the footsteps of kings, and the prayers of thousands. By the mid-1200s, work focused on the transepts, the arms of the cross-shaped layout that gave Gothic cathedrals their iconic floor plan. Under architect Jean de Chelles, and later Pierre de Montreuil, these wings were expanded and adorned with new rose windows, even more ornate than those on the western end. The north transept featured a luminous window that bathed the space in cool blues and heavenly purples. The south, warmer, fiery, and just as divine. These weren't just design choices, they were theology in colour. The northern window represented the Old Testament, the southern, the New. The two wings told the full story of salvation, one illuminated in light, the other in fire. Inside the cathedral, columns soared like tree trunks in a forest of stone. Vaulted ceilings stretched nearly 35 metres high, their ribbed arches meeting like palms in prayer. This wasn't architecture. It was choreography, an upward motion guiding the soul toward heaven. And then there was the altar, the sacred centre of the space. Here, the Mass was celebrated. Here, relics were venerated. And here, the elite of France came to kneel. Royal weddings, coronation masses, papal visits. Notre Dame became the spiritual stage for the nation itself. But it wasn't just the elite who filled these walls. The people came too. Merchants, peasants, pilgrims. The cathedral became a public sanctuary, echoing with sermons, songs, and the occasional scolding from the pulpit. It was a place to witness miracles, or to beg for one. Every surface inside told a story. The sculptures, the stained glass, even the floor tiles. Notre Dame didn't just house the divine, it performed it. Faith was everywhere, carved in stone, floating in incense, radiating from glass. By the late 13th century, the interior was nearly complete. The heart of the cathedral beat strong. But it still lacked one thing, a crown to pierce the heavens. And that's when they began building the spire. By the end of the 1200s, Notre Dame already looked like a miracle. Its towers soared, its nave echoed with sacred chants, and its rose windows flooded the interior with divine light. But something still seemed unfinished. The cathedral had a face, a heart, and wings, but no crown. No vertical accent to lead the eye beyond the roofline and into the heavens. That's when plans began for the spire. Unlike the twin towers, which were heavy and grounded, the spire would be elegant. An upward-pointing needle, rising from the crossing of the transept, right at the centre of the church's cruciform layout. Constructed from oak and clad in lead, the original spire was both a technical challenge and a spiritual statement. This wasn't just decoration. It was the exclamation point of Notre Dame, its most visible prayer. Its construction demanded master carpenters and metalsmiths. Oak beams were hoisted by human power, winches, pulleys, scaffolding. The structure had to be light, yet stable, to withstand the winds that battered Paris from the Seine. When finished, the spire pierced the sky like a sword lifted in devotion, and beneath it, even more intricate work was unfolding. Gargoyles, those bizarre, haunting creatures, emerged from the stone. They weren't just grotesque for fun. Many served as waterspouts, diverting rain away from the masonry. Others were symbolic, guardians meant to frighten away evil or remind sinners of what awaited them. The final phase also included dozens of chimeras, statues of hybrid beasts perched high above Paris, their eyes forever scanning the horizon. They were nightmare and marvel rolled into one, part of the Gothic love affair with mystery and symbolism. Inside, the chapels were completed, choir stalls carved, and relics enshrined. Notre Dame was now fully operational, both a sacred machine and a national stage. It had taken over a century of work, tens of thousands of workers, and the faith of an entire kingdom. By 1345, nearly 200 years after the first stone was laid, the cathedral was considered complete. But complete was never the right word. Notre Dame was never frozen in time. It would be restored, reinvented, and resurrected across centuries. But by the 14th century, the structure itself was done. The Gothic age had built its masterpiece. By the mid-14th century, Notre Dame de Paris was no longer just a cathedral, it was the cathedral, a towering symbol of Catholic dominance, royal authority, and national identity. For the next 4 centuries, it stood not only as the heart of Paris, but as a stage upon which the great dramas of France would unfold. It became the beating heart of state religion, hosting coronations, royal weddings, and solemn funerals. When kings married, they did so under its vaulted ceilings. When wars were declared or victories celebrated, the bells of Notre Dame rang loud across the Seine. Monarchs entered as rulers of land and exited as chosen of God. But it wasn't only kings who passed through those great doors. Generals, bishops, and foreign dignitaries came to kneel or negotiate, and when disasters struck, famines, plagues, invasions, Parisians filled the nave with prayers and processions, desperate for divine intervention. The cathedral became a sanctuary of hope and fear, always watching, always waiting. Politically, Notre Dame became the spiritual anchor of the French monarchy. Its central location, on the Île de la Cité, at the literal and symbolic heart of Paris, made it the perfect backdrop for ritualized power. Priests blessed banners before war. The crown was linked not just to royal blood, but to divine mandate. If the king ruled France, then Notre Dame ruled his soul. And culturally, it remained a centre of awe. Pilgrims travelled miles just to glimpse its sacred relics, including the crown of thorns, believed to have been worn by Christ himself. Its great organ thundered during feast days. Its choirs echoed with polyphonic music that pushed medieval boundaries. Notre Dame wasn't static. It evolved, absorbing new art styles, musical traditions, and liturgical forms. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, its Gothic beauty began to fall out of favour. Baroque architecture was in vogue, and Notre Dame, dark, spiky, and medieval, was seen as outdated. Some renovations were even attempted to modernise its look, smoothing what had once been daring. Still, it stood, a cathedral caught between centuries, revered, yet increasingly overlooked. Its towers weathered storms and time. Its bells still tolled. But something was shifting beneath its foundations. Notre Dame had been born from faith and crowned by kings. But soon it would face a force even stone couldn't ignore. Revolution. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Notre-Dame de Paris found itself on the wrong side of history. For centuries, it had stood as a monument to monarchy and religion, two of the very institutions the Revolution sought to erase. Suddenly, the cathedral that had once crowned kings became a symbol of oppression, and symbols during revolutions rarely survive untouched. The attack was ideological and physical. Revolutionaries stormed into the cathedral. Statues of the biblical kings that adorned the facade were mistaken for French monarchs. All 28 were beheaded. Sculptures were smashed, altars desecrated. The great bells that had once tolled for royal births and papal visits were torn down and melted for cannon metal. Precious relics, like the crown of thorns, were removed and hidden. Many were lost. What remained was a hollowed shell. Notre Dame was officially deconsecrated in 1793. It was no longer a church. Instead, it became the so-called Temple of Reason, repurposed for revolutionary festivals celebrating secular enlightenment. At one point, it was even used as a warehouse for storing wine. The soaring nave, once echoing with hymns, now smelled of spilled barrels and damp stone. The spire, damaged and decaying, was eventually dismantled for safety. Gargoyles fell from their perches. The roof leaked. Rats scurried through the crypt. It seemed as though Paris no longer had a heart, just a forgotten ruin in its centre. And yet, it survived. When Napoleon came to power, he recognised the symbolic power of Notre Dame. In 1804, he chose it as the site of his self-coronation as emperor. The cathedral was reconsecrated and cleaned up just enough to host the lavish ceremony. But this wasn't a religious act. It was theatre. Napoleon crowned himself, famously snatching the crown from the Pope's hands. Notre Dame, once again, served the powerful, but without the sanctity it had once embodied. Still, decades of neglect left their scars. By the 1830s, Notre Dame was crumbling, physically and spiritually. It was slated for demolition more than once. Some Parisians thought it would be better to replace it with something modern, something less medieval, less haunting. And then, a writer stepped in. A writer who would see past the cracked stones and shattered statues to something eternal, something worth saving. Because just when the world was ready to forget Notre Dame, Victor Hugo reminded them. In 1831, a book hit the shelves that would save a cathedral. Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, later known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, wasn't just a Gothic novel. It was a passionate plea for preservation. Through the eyes of Quasimodo, the deformed bell ringer, Hugo turned Notre Dame into more than just a backdrop. It was a living character, wounded, misunderstood, beautiful in its decay. And the public listened. The novel stirred hearts across France. Suddenly, Parisians realized what they were about to lose. Notre Dame wasn't just old, it was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. The outcry worked. By 1844, King Louis-Philippe approved a full-scale restoration of the cathedral. Leading the charge were two architects, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Their goal wasn't just to repair the damage, but to restore the soul of the cathedral. They replaced eroded statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and reimagined the spire that had been removed during the Revolution. This new spire, designed by Viollet-le-Duc, would rise 96 metres above the ground, taller and more ornate than the original. It would become one of the most iconic silhouettes in Europe. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Notre Dame returned to its rightful place, at the spiritual and cultural centre of Paris. It hosted masses, witnessed liberation ceremonies, and welcomed millions of visitors. It survived 2 world wars. During the Nazi occupation, its bells remained silent. When Paris was finally liberated in 1944, they rang out in triumph, But tragedy would strike again. On April 15, 2019, a fire broke out beneath the roof. Within minutes, flames engulfed the wooden lattice known as the forest, some beams dating back to the 13th century. The fire raged for hours. The roof collapsed. The 19th century spire fell in a plume of smoke. The world watched in horror as one of humanity's greatest monuments seemed to vanish in real time. And yet, once again, it survived. The stone towers stood firm. The rose windows endured. The relics were saved. And the people of France, along with the world, vowed to rebuild. Notre Dame has always been more than architecture. It is memory, identity, resilience, a church, a symbol, a survivor. And in every stone that rises from its ashes, it reminds us faith and beauty can be reborn. She was born in 1775 in the Guangdong province of China. Her birth name was never recorded. History would come to know her simply as Zheng Yi Sao, wife of Zheng Yi. But what she did with that name would shake empires. In her early years, she was a prostitute aboard a Cantonese floating brothel, a common reality for poor girls in 18th century coastal China. These so-called flower boats catered to merchants, naval officers, and pirates. But she wasn't like the others. She listened. She watched. She remembered names. She made powerful clients talk. Over time, she became more than entertainment. She became an information broker. And then came Zheng Yi, a powerful pirate lord who commanded the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most formidable pirate factions in the South China Sea. He wasn't the first pirate she served, but he would be the last. Struck by her wit and cunning, Zheng Yi proposed marriage. She accepted, but not without terms. In a move practically unheard of in her time, she negotiated her position. She wanted joint control of the fleet, not just as a wife, but as a partner. She would handle political alliances, manage plunder, and have a say in every strategic move. Zheng Yi agreed. Whether out of love or shrewdness, he knew she was an asset. Their marriage in 1801 was the beginning of one of the most successful pirate dynasties in history. Zheng Yisou quickly embedded herself into the fabric of pirate politics. She studied the hierarchies, the rivalries, and the codes of the pirate world. While Zheng Yi sailed and conquered, she quietly built networks, recruited allies, and learned to rule from the shadows. But she didn't stay in the shadows for long. When Zheng Yi suddenly died in 1807, possibly in a typhoon, many assumed his empire would fracture. Dozens of pirate captains waited to pounce, expecting a power vacuum. What they got instead was a power grab. Zheng Yi Sao stepped into command, not with brute force, but with strategy. She took over the Red Flag Fleet, she solidified alliances, and she married Zheng Yi's adopted son and lieutenant, Chung Po Tsai, ensuring both personal loyalty and military strength. From prostitute to pirate queen in less than a decade, and she was just getting started. When Zheng Yi Sao took command in 1807, she didn't just inherit a pirate fleet, she inherited a floating kingdom. But instead of it splintering in chaos after her husband's death, she tightened her grip and made it even more powerful. Under her rule, the Red Flag Fleet didn't just survive, it multiplied. The South China Sea had long been plagued by pirates. But what Zheng Yi Sao commanded was unprecedented. She oversaw an armada of over 300 ships, and within a year, that number swelled to more than 600. Some estimates claim she eventually led over 1,800 vessels with up to 70,000 men under her command, more than the navies of several European powers combined at the time. She did this with ruthless pragmatism and a keen understanding of pirate psychology. She maintained power not just through force, but by creating a system that bound her captains to her. She instituted a strict code of laws that governed every part of pirate life: loot, loyalty, discipline, and punishment. Disobedience was met with swift brutality. Anyone caught stealing from the common treasury lost their head. If a pirate assaulted a female captive without permission, he was executed. If a pirate deserted, his ears were cut off, and he was paraded before the fleet as a warning. But it wasn't just fear. Zheng Yisao offered protection, structure, and profit. Her code allowed pirates to keep a fair share of loot, 20%, while the rest went to a communal fund managed by her. This gave everyone a stake in the system and built loyalty through stability. Even defeated rivals and coastal villagers often chose to join her rather than resist. She divided the massive fleet into 6 squadrons, each with its own colour: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green, but all ultimately reported to her. Her closest ally and second-in-command, Chung Po Tsai, led the Red Squadron, her elite force. Under Zheng Yisao, piracy became a government of its own, with taxation, defence, and hierarchy. She ruled sea lanes from Vietnam to Hong Kong, controlling trade, raiding imperial outposts, and even collecting tribute from coastal towns. The Qing dynasty had a navy, Zheng Yisao had an empire, and it was only growing. Zheng Yisao didn't just rule with charisma, she ruled with rules. Iron ones. While the image of pirates often conjures up chaos and drunken revelry, her fleet operated more like a disciplined corporation than a gang of outlaws. And at the centre of this structure was her pirate code, a detailed system of laws that turned mayhem into method. This code wasn't some romantic parchment passed around by candlelight. It was brutal, binding, and enforced without hesitation. Every captain and crew member knew the stakes. Violation meant humiliation at best, execution at worst. One of the most infamous rules governed the division of spoils. After a raid, all loot had to be presented to the fleet's central storehouse. The pirate responsible received a 20% cut, while the rest went into the collective pool. That pool, controlled by Zheng Yisao and her officers, was used for fleet maintenance, widow pensions, bribes, and emergency funds. Stealing from the collective wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable by death. Then came discipline. Disobedience in battle was a serious offence. Cowards who abandoned their squadron or disobeyed orders could be flogged, executed, or thrown into the sea. Desertion? Immediate decapitation. The code even addressed relationships. If a pirate kidnapped a woman, he was required to treat her with respect. Sexual assault was grounds for execution by beheading. She wasn't interested in chaos. She was interested in control, and the code gave her that. It created a reliable system where pirates knew the rules, the consequences, and their share. It bound loyalty not just to Zheng Yisao as a leader, but to the system she embodied. Incredibly, she allowed prisoners and coastal civilians to join her forces. In exchange, they had to swear loyalty to her code. Many did. Some joined out of fear, others out of admiration. Some simply understood that under Zheng Yisao, piracy was safer, more profitable, and strangely, more fair than life under the corrupt Qing authorities. Her laws extended beyond the decks of ships. Coastal villages under her protection paid tribute in exchange for safety and autonomy. Those who resisted were burned to the ground. Those who complied became part of her growing empire. She wasn't just a pirate. She was a sovereign. And her code was law. By 1808, Zheng Yisao's pirate empire was no longer just a maritime nuisance. It was a national threat. Her fleet dominated the South China Sea, disrupted trade routes, and raided coastal towns with impunity. The Qing dynasty, embarrassed and overwhelmed, was forced to act, but they weren't ready for what they were up against. The Imperial Navy launched a campaign to crush the pirates, sending multiple warships to hunt down Zheng Yisao's fleet. What followed was not a series of quick victories, but a humiliating display of imperial incompetence. Time and again, the Navy was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outclassed by Zheng Yisao's forces. She knew the waters better than anyone. She used weather patterns, island cover, and shallow tides to trap heavier Qing ships. Her sailors could fight in coordinated units, switch vessels mid-battle, and lure enemies into ambushes with terrifying precision. On more than one occasion, entire Qing squadrons were captured, their ships absorbed into the Red Flag fleet. And morale? the difference was staggering. While imperial officers were often corrupt, underpaid or cowardly, Zheng Yisao's men were well organized and fiercely loyal, bound by her code and rewarded for victory. As the battles dragged on, the Qing dynasty's desperation became obvious. They appealed to European powers, namely the Portuguese and the British, to assist in naval engagements. These foreign navies had more advanced ships and firepower, but they lacked the local knowledge and unity of purpose that Zheng Yisao's armada possessed. Still, the pressure mounted. By 1809, a coalition of Qing, Portuguese and Cantonese forces surrounded parts of her fleet. Yet even then, she fought them off, retreating strategically and launching counterattacks that stunned her enemies. She wasn't just surviving, she was humiliating the empire. But the war was costly. Sustained conflict drained resources and exhausted men. Even pirate empires can't endure war forever. And while she remained unbeaten at sea, Zheng Yisao understood something crucial. Sometimes, power isn't about winning every fight. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to walk away, with everything intact. She had no intention of dying at sea or being dragged in chains to a Qing court. She had a different plan, one that would leave even her enemies stunned. By 1810, Zheng Yisao had done the impossible. She had held off the might of the Qing dynasty, humiliated foreign navies, and ruled the waves with unmatched dominance. But she was also a realist. She knew that wars, especially ones with endless fronts and growing enemies, couldn't be fought forever. Supplies were thinning, alliances strained, and her fleet, though still massive, was beginning to feel the weight of attrition. So, she changed tactics. Zheng Yisao reached out to the Qing government, not with surrender, but with terms. Bold ones. She knew she held leverage. The Qing had failed to beat her militarily. Their own citizens feared her more than they respected the empire. She could bargain not as a criminal begging for mercy, but as a leader of a state. She travelled to Guangzhou personally, on her own ship, surrounded by armed guards, flying the Red Flag Fleet's colours proudly. It wasn't a plea, it was a power move. She requested amnesty, not just for herself, but for her entire fleet. Thousands of pirates. She demanded the right to keep her wealth. She even insisted her second-in-command and husband, Chung Po Tsai, be given a military rank in the Qing Navy. The government was stunned, but the truth was, they were tired too. The empire couldn't afford another costly, drawn-out campaign. So, in a moment of rare pragmatism, they agreed. Zheng Yisao surrendered with style. On April 18, 1810, she led over 17,000 pirates, men, women and children, into the city, not in chains, but in procession. Over 200 ships were handed over, weapons laid down ceremonially, and the entire pirate confederation disbanded without a drop of blood spilled. No trials, no executions, no forfeiture of wealth. Chung Po Tsai was granted a captaincy in the Qing Navy. Zheng Yisao retired as a free woman, untouched, undefeated, and still immensely rich. In a world where most pirate stories end in betrayal or death, Zheng Yisao's ended with negotiation and retirement. She had played the game perfectly, first with cannons, then with words. And as her red banners came down, her legend was only beginning to rise. Most pirate stories end in blood, gallows, or obscurity. But Zheng Yisao didn't just escape that fate. She built a second life from it. After negotiating the greatest pirate surrender in history, she walked away not as a fugitive, but as a respected, wealthy woman with her legacy intact. In 1810, after the surrender of her fleet, she settled in Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, with her husband Chung Po Tsai, who now served as a captain in the Qing Navy. The transition from pirate queen to respectable citizen might seem absurd, but for Zheng Yisao, it was just another act of calculated survival. She lived openly, even comfortably, and the Qing authorities largely left her alone. Rather than fading into obscurity, she quietly became a businesswoman. She opened a gambling house and an opium smuggling operation, technically illegal, but largely overlooked due to her influence. She wasn't out to build another empire, but she had no intention of being forgotten either. She kept her connections, protected her wealth, and lived on her terms. Her marriage to Chung Po Tsai endured, and together they raised a family. While he continued serving the Qing Navy, hunting down pirates ironically similar to their past selves, Zheng Yisao focused on their business interests. She moved in elite circles, consulted on maritime affairs, and remained a legendary figure among sailors and traders throughout the South China coast. What's extraordinary isn't just that she lived, it's how she lived. She broke every mold her society had for women. Born poor, sold into prostitution, she clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated criminal world. Then, instead of dying in battle or on the scaffold, she retired peacefully and died of old age in 1844, at the age of 69. She didn't seek redemption. She didn't need it. Her life was the ultimate act of defiance, a living rebuttal to every law, custom, and expectation set before her. In a time when women were barely allowed to speak in public, Zheng Yisao commanded fleets, dictated treaties, and negotiated with emperors. And then, she walked away richer and freer than any pirate in history. Her sails lowered, her cannons quiet, yet her legend still echoed across the sea. History remembers pirates like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan, men who roamed the Caribbean, sowed chaos, and met violent ends. But in the shadow of their infamy stands Zheng Yisao, not only as their equal, but as someone who surpassed them by almost every measure. She didn't captain a handful of ships. She commanded entire fleets. She didn't plunder a few coastal towns. She controlled entire regions of the sea. And she didn't die on the gallows or in a gunfight. She negotiated her way out of piracy and into peace. Among the pantheon of pirate legends, she remains the most successful and least understood. But make no mistake, her success wasn't just luck or ruthlessness. It was strategy, intellect, and a deep understanding of power. She was a tactician, a politician, and a psychologist. She knew how to keep loyalty through fear, yes, but also through order, reward, and a carefully crafted system. And what made her truly exceptional was the fact that she achieved all of this as a woman in Qing-era China, a society steeped in Confucian ideals that confined women to silence and servitude. Women weren't expected to lead in the marketplace, much less on the high seas. Zheng Yisao didn't just challenge that norm, she shattered it. She earned the respect of hardened pirate captains, forced the Qing dynasty to the negotiating table, and ended her life as a business owner and matriarch. She wasn't dependent on a man's legacy. She took it, expanded it, and made it her own. In popular memory, she remains something of a phantom, less famous than her male counterparts, less romanticized in Western literature, and often omitted from mainstream history. But within maritime circles and Chinese coastal lore, she is spoken of with awe. The Red Flag fleet may have vanished, its sails lowered for good, but the memory of Zheng Yisao lingers like a ghost ship, silent, untouchable, and larger than life. Not just a pirate, not just a woman, but a legend that made empires kneel. And in a world ruled by men, she didn't ask for a place at the table. She took the entire ocean. Despite commanding the largest pirate fleet the world has ever seen, Zheng Yisao remains strangely absent from most mainstream history books. Her legacy, though immense, has been obscured, overshadowed by Western pirate myths, and buried beneath layers of colonial bias, gender prejudice, and political discomfort. Why? Because her story doesn't fit the traditional mold. She wasn't a tragic anti-hero like Blackbeard. She didn't die in battle. She wasn't European. And most threatening of all, she was a woman who outplayed an empire. That kind of power disrupts the neat, male-dominated narrative historians have long preferred. In Chinese official records, she's treated more like a problem solved than a figure worth studying. The Qing dynasty didn't want to celebrate her. They wanted to forget her. After all, She exposed their naval weakness, defied imperial authority, and walked away without punishment. Even in success, she was an embarrassment to the throne. Western historians fared no better. For centuries, piracy has been romanticized through a European lens: peg legs, rum, parrots, and plunder. Zheng Yisao didn't fit that image. She wasn't swashbuckling. She was strategic. She didn't duel for glory. She negotiated for power. She wasn't killed by the state. She negotiated with it and won. And for many chroniclers, that wasn't exciting. It was inconvenient. But in recent decades, her legend has re-emerged. Scholars, feminist historians, and pirate enthusiasts have begun to resurrect her memory, reclaiming her place in the global story of maritime power. Documentaries, historical novels, and even video games have started to acknowledge the pirate queen of the South China Sea. And still, so much of her life remains shrouded in mystery. Her real name is lost. Much of her voice survives only through the lens of her enemies: Qing officials, foreign sailors, and later, European observers. But what little we know is enough to build the silhouette of a titan. She wasn't just a woman who broke the mold. She was a woman who never cared it existed. Zheng Yisao didn't need the world's permission to become powerful. She took power, wielded it with precision, and vanished into history with more wealth, authority, and dignity than any pirate, male or female, before or after. She didn't fade. She was erased. But legends, as always, find their way back. Zheng Yisao didn't wear a crown. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from a throne or royal blood. It came from command, from respect, from fear, from thousands of voices shouting her orders across the waves. In every real sense of the word, she was a queen, a monarch of a kingdom without borders, flags, or fixed territory. Her domain was the South China Sea, and her reach stretched from the Gulf of Tonkin to the shores of Guangdong. She built something no one had before or since. Her pirate confederation was not just criminal. It was political, organized, functioning. She controlled trade routes, established codes of law, negotiated treaties, and enforced order across a region that even the Qing Empire struggled to govern. Her ships weren't scattered raiders, they were fleets. Her captains weren't freelancers, they were officers. Her people weren't rogues, they were citizens of a floating nation. And yet, what makes her legacy truly unmatched is not just her rise, but her exit. Most pirate stories end in fire and rope. Zheng Yisao's ended in negotiation, retirement, and wealth. She didn't go down with her ship. She stepped off it, unscathed, unbowed, and still holding the purse strings. By the time she died in 1844, she had done what no pirate, no emperor, no general had done before. She walked away from absolute power by choice and kept her legend intact. Today, few monuments bear her name. No palace, no statue in the square, but her presence haunts the South China Sea like a storm cloud that never left. In the whispers of sailors, in the ink of rebel women, in the hearts of those who understand that leadership is not about birthright, but about will. Zheng Yisao was proof that greatness doesn't ask permission, that even in a world built to silence women, one voice, sharp, strategic, and unyielding, can command an empire. She ruled without apology, she fought without hesitation, and she retired without defeat. Not a myth, not a legend, but a woman who conquered the sea, and walked away before it could take her. Her sails are gone, but her shadow still stretches across the waves.